I did not, 9 years ago, before I had recovery in my life, before I was sober,
Mhm.
um, did not imagine a scenario where I could be sitting here talking to you saying I'm no longer in bondage,
Mhm.
where I could be, living with my family, going home at night, not as a perfect husband, not as a perfect dad. I'm a human, but without secrets, without
Right.
shame,
Mhm.
to be able to talk to my boys and lead them to try to mold them as young men without feeling like I'm a fraud, without feeling like I'm an imposter because I got this whole double life that I'm leading.
Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by my man, Audley Stephenson, the Odd Man.
Greetings and salutations. Welcome to the Audacious Living Podcast, where our goal is to empower and inspire our listeners to live their best audacious lives ever. I'm delighted to be sharing valuable insights with you, and I thank all our listeners for taking the time to join us on this journey. Now, just as a phoenix rises from the ashes, overcoming sexual addiction is a process of transformation and rebirth. In our interview with Logan Hufford, we explore how one can overcome challenges and emerge stronger and more resilient. Logan is a dedicated advocate for recovery from sexual addiction and a mentor helping others find healing and restoration in their lives. With over 8 years of personal recovery experience, Logan is very passionate about sharing his story to inspire and support others to break free from the chains of sexual addiction. Logan's expertise and insights are crucial to this episode as we delve deep into the topic of overcoming sexual addiction and reclaiming control over our lives. So now that we got you all set and ready to go, let's jump into our conversation with Logan. Enjoy. Hey, Logan, thank you for joining me here on the Audacious Living Podcast. I appreciate you, my friend, making a time like this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me on, Audley.
Well, hey, look, I am very appreciative of being able to engage in conversations, really, and anything to help individuals get to that better place, that best audacious life that we talk about. And really, it's about look, we're all on our own path, right? And that road that we get to this place of greatness is not going to be the exact same, and the things that we have on our pathways are going to be different. Some are dealing with trauma, some are dealing with fear, some are dealing with just all kinds of things that are happening, and so they're different, right? However, there's still obstacles that are in our path, and we've got to find a way to get through them. And that's really what we really want to encourage, how to do that and how we get through that and how we get to that better place. You have your own unique story with respects to addiction, specifically like sexual addictions, which may surprise some people. May not necessarily always, oh, that's an addiction, but it certainly can, and it can derail you if you're not careful. So maybe as a starting point, Logan, you can describe a little bit to our listeners a little bit of your story and what's brought you to the point that you're at now.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm Logan Hufford, and I'm no longer in bondage to sexual addiction. And I say that I introduce myself that way in a lot of the interviews, and it's that's the same way I introduce myself at a recovery meeting. And it wasn't always that way. I mean, I've been in recovery now for 8+ years. For a long time, I would say, I'm Logan, I'm a recovering sex addict. And there was a time and place for that verbiage. There was a time and place for that identity.
Right.
But it's shifted a bit to where I felt a personal conviction to go, no, I'm no longer in bondage. Recovery is always going to be a part of my life, in the same way that, if I had an injury, like, the type of therapy that I'm doing or the type of things that I'm doing is going to morph, but I should always be taking care of myself. Right. And so recovery, healthy living, healthy tools, healthy infrastructure, that's always going to be a part of my life. But yeah, I did not, 9 years ago, before I had recovery in my life, before I was sober,
Mhm.
did not imagine a scenario where I could be sitting here talking to you saying I'm no longer in bondage,
Mhm.
where I could be, living with my family, going home at night, not as a perfect husband, not as a perfect dad. I'm a human, but without secrets, without
Right.
shame, To be able to talk to my boys and lead them to try to mold them as young men without feeling like I'm a fraud, without feeling like I'm an imposter because I got this whole double life that I'm leading.
Gotcha.
Because for so many years, that was my life. I mean, it was porn, affairs, hiring prostitutes, this whole plus other addictions as well as sexual addiction. And all of this was, as a married guy with 4 boys.
Right.
So the despair and hopelessness was just essentially a perpetual state of mind for me for a lot of years.
Yeah. When you, as you started to describe it, to be honest, when you said 4 boys, when it really sort of hit me, because again, you've got these young men that you're raising, and you've got this double life as you said. During I guess the challenge of, when it got to the worst period, for you, the impact on your children, was that ever a factor, and how did that come into play into your overall situation?
It wasn't something that motivated me nearly enough, for sure. It was something that I was aware of. Like, hey, I've got kids. I've got boys that, for better or for worse, are going to be looking up to me on some level. But I mean, the whole time I was active in my addiction as a married guy. I mean, I knew, like, the stuff I was doing. I knew that it was wrong. I hated that I was doing it. There's never a part of me that was like, oh, this is fine, it's all good. Like, I absolutely lived in despair and lived in just feeling terrible, all this remorse. But my infrastructure didn't change. The decision-making process, how I approached life, none of that changed. And what I didn't realize was that I had spent years, this is not just a metaphor, like literally years rewiring my brain in a really unhealthy way to become this person who, I chased after whatever high I could get from sexual behavior, again, other addictions as well. Had a huge sports gambling addiction. And it, when we start off talking about sexual addiction,
yep.
I'll speak from my perspective. This is definitely true of a lot of folks. It's not actually an addiction to sexual behavior necessarily. It's an addiction to the high that I get from chasing after, which might sound like tomato, but it's like, it's not about, oh man, I need sex so bad, I've got to go find sex. Mm-hmm. Like there were moments where that line of thinking might have been there, but it wasn't about not having enough of something. It wasn't about, I'm not getting enough of something. It was, right. I was Pavlov's dog, but an X-rated version, where it's just like something, there'd be a trigger, whether I introduced it or not, there'd be a trigger. And then it almost felt like an automatic process from there, that I'm going to go to the next steps. I'm going to go seek out and act out pornography, or I'm going to go, seek to act out with this woman, or again, a prostitute, phone sex line, whatever the opportunity gave me, kind of thing. But it felt like I couldn't stop. It felt like I was on autopilot, and this is just, these are my only options. And I use verbiage like it felt like, yep, because that's accurate. But I also, I'm very, try to be extremely careful to, I don't ever blame my addiction. I don't ever blame something else. I don't blame my triggers. I made my choices, even in my unhealthiest of spots. Mm-hmm. I chose to continue making unhealthy choices, even though it didn't feel like I had options sometimes. Yes. Look, recovery, one of the beautiful parts about recovery is it allows me to go back. It's like watching the tape. I can go back, watch the tape, and I can see all these opportunities I had to do the right thing. Yes. And I didn't take those opportunities.
Yeah. I think that oftentimes is lost on individuals, that the choice is always within reach. and it's a matter of you deciding. And as much as we want to say, well, I didn't, we actually did have a choice.
Yeah.
Now there are some instances when we're so far down the road that we've lost an opportunity for choice. Now we're accepting of the consequences, but those consequences are still as a result of the choices that we made. And so I think that's an important reminder for individuals to bear that in mind, that the choice is definitely always ours.
And there is a very real, there's a very real physiological thing that happens. And this is, I mean, this is with addiction in general. It's especially true with sexual addiction that,
Okay.
you know, every time I'm seeking out and getting that dopamine hit, every time I'm seeking that chemical release, every time I'm doing that with pornography, with affairs, you know, all these different behaviors. I mean, there's literal brain damage that's happening. There's a rewiring of neural pathways that's happening.
Mm-hmm.
And it is true that, like, the further I go down that path, the more stunted my developmental process is, the more stunted my decision-making process is. And so it's a tricky balance, because there is absolute truth in the fact that the further I go into addiction, the less cognitive function I have. Like, it truly does become harder and harder to make a healthy choice.
Yes.
But again, I'll speak for myself. Even, I mean, I spent years in this addiction. I went darker and deeper than most people. And yet, even still, I had choices. I had options. And I mean, I praise God, because when he brought me to a group that I tried some different groups, I tried some different meetings.
Mm-hmm.
And there, when I found a group that had multiple guys that had my story, multiple guys that had been to the places I'd been,
Yep.
and they had healing, I didn't think that was possible. And it's, you know, it wasn't like that day I suddenly just flipped a switch and then boom, now I'm a healthy person. It was a non-linear journey. It took time.
Sure.
But, you know, that was the first moment I had hope. That was March of 2016, the first time I went to a prodigals meeting. And finally, you know, there's like, okay, now I can connect with other guys who've been in my shoes, who've been in these trenches. I can bounce my ideas off of them. I can talk with them. I can be accountable to them. And it was a growing pains process. It was not linear, not easy. But for me, that was such a crucial difference. Was, okay, I'm not the only, because I always knew I wasn't the only one who looked at porn. I wasn't the only one who cheated on my wife. Mm-hmm. But I truly did think nobody's ever been where I've been, right, and then had a good life.
Yeah.
Like, other people have been where I've been, but their life's always probably screwed up for the rest of their life. And the idea that there was transformation possible, restoration possible, I didn't fathom that.
You know, I've oftentimes said that, you know, we're going through when going through challenges, it's really easy to think that, you know, no one on the planet has any concept, has any idea, has any thought what the feeling that you're going through with the challenge that you're in the midst of. But you know, the reality is, you know, that there really isn't much new under the sun. I'd say there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
And if you look, you look, there's someone that's out there that's probably done it already, that's overcome it,
that's healed from it. Yeah.
Healed from it, that's transformed from it, who's on the other side going, yeah, it's possible. And so, yeah, you know, the help definitely is there. I'm curious, and we talk a little about your sons, and I'm curious about sort of the relationship, how your addiction impacted your relationship with your sons as well as your wife. What did that do? Because we know how hard the oftentimes our relationships are damaged and fractured and sometimes destroyed. So I'm just curious what that looked like for you.
Yeah, a little bit of context. So I got married June 4th, 2011. I was 20 years old. My wife was 21. And 11 months later, we had our first boy, Elijah. We've got 4 boys, and they're born in 5 years. Okay. So my addiction started before I got married, but to be honest, it only got magnified. It only got worse as I was married, and the shame and the double life just increased and increased. So married, a kid, another boy, then another boy, then, you know, we were pregnant with our 4th boy, and then gave birth to him literally right, like, the same month I went to that prodigals meeting. That we had our first boy at the end of that month, and then I got sober a couple months later. So, my boys were young, but yeah, raising them in that house. And with this addiction, of course, it manifests differently, even amongst sex addicts. I mean, it's going to manifest differently with different people.
Sure.
For me, and this is one of the tricky parts about sexual addiction is, there's no alcohol smell on my breath. There's no, drug test. There's no track marks on my arm. There's no, my eyes are bloodshot, right? Like of course, now for my wife, there were physical symptoms that she could see, she understood me and knew me well enough that she could see something was off. But for the average person, you wouldn't notice anything different about me. In fact,
no obvious signs.
Right. And truthfully, I mean, you talk to a lot of people that knew me then, they would tell you they always thought of me as the stand-up guy, as such a good guy, as such a nice guy. And I mean, just, I could always work the room and get what I wanted from different people and stuff. So to answer your question, I mean, in terms of how it affected my family, what it looked like with my boys, at least from my perspective, was, I mean, I always was aware, I was keenly aware of what my role should be. Like I've always had values and beliefs that were instilled in me from a young age that, I'm to be the leader of my house, and I'm to, as a man, I'm an example for my boys. And which because of my actions, that only further cemented my shame. It just further like drove me down and deeper because I hated, like, I can't be a good dad. I'll never be a good dad. So I went through some of the motions. I mean, I would, I'd read the Bible to my kids at night. I'd tuck them in and just like all the while, hearing like this mocking voice inside me, like, dude, you're a fraud.
Right.
None of this matters. You're not real. All you're doing is hurting your family every single day. Like you're just putting on a show.
Right.
So I would try to do some of the things, even if it felt like I was forcing it. It was like, I know I won't be a good example, but let me at least try to, teach them some things, from the Bible, try to teach them some things, but I for sure won't be a good example for them, which is a really dark place to live, really, really dark place to be a dad. But that's where I was.
Right.
And of course with addiction, so not only does it manifest differently, but, if I'm an addict, more than likely I've got lots of parts of my life that are very unhealthy. Because that cognitive control, that cognitive function, that decision-making process, all of that is stunted. All of that is corrupted. My finances, the way I treat people, my physical health, generally speaking, all of that stuff is probably going to be affected pretty severely. Every once in a while, I'll meet somebody that they've got a severe addiction, but financially they're doing fine, or their physical health is primo. Like, but mostly that's not the case. Mostly it affects all the areas of my life. And that was definitely true for me. It was no more true than with my anger. Anger was a huge problem for me. To be honest, it continued well into sobriety. I've been sober for over 8 years. It wasn't until about 3.5 years ago that I started having serious progressive victory over anger.
Gotcha.
So I mean, raging on my kids, lashing out, yelling at my boys when they wouldn't, they wouldn't do what they were told, they're not obeying, they're not going to their beds, whatever, slamming my fist into the drywall, throwing my phone. Just that was, and just like acting out, the second I would do that, hate myself, just hate what I did, hate the fact that they've got to live with such a crappy dad.
Right.
But then I would do it again, the next time I was angry. With my wife, so again, context wise, so I confessed my sexual affairs to her. Okay. Starting 6 months after we got married. To that point, I'd already had several affairs, but that was the first time I confessed to her, and I wrote her a letter. So this would have been the winter of 2011, 2012. We've been married for 6 months, roughly. And in that moment, when I wrote that letter, I thought that I was done. Like I've done these terrible things, but I'm never going to do it again. I feel so awful. I'm never going to do it again. And so I wrote her this letter, confessed it. And nothing changed in my infrastructure. Nothing changed in my decision-making process. Nothing changed with having accountability and getting healing. And so I, had another affair. It would work out to about once or twice a year, I'd have a sexual affair. So that, masturbation to pornography, flirting with women, inappropriate texting conversations, that was daily. That was just always there. That was baseline stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then, kind of working up I'm definitely not courage. I'm kind of having a brain fart here, but just working up the will, I guess, to bust through what I had to bust through to have another sexual affair. That always took time. It took, time, but that would happen about once or twice a year. And every time I would confess it to her. And as time went on, she became more and more kind of frozen, more and more just numb to it. Not that it didn't hurt tremendously, of course, but she's in survival mode. She's a young mom. She's trying to take care of our kids, and she's got her husband coming home hitting her with this stuff. Right. And so she had no clue, how to respond. And for the longest time, she would tell you, she always thought that I was cheating on her because she wasn't enough. She wasn't, sexually available enough or pretty enough, or there's something missing. So not to, jump around too much, but shortly after I got into recovery in 2016, my wife, Carrie, got into recovery for sexual betrayal trauma, which is a whole other piece to this, that she has jumped into her own healing because absolutely, I mean, she was abused and wounded by all of this, especially plus the verbal abuse, the emotional abuse. So it's one thing for me to get into recovery and get that healing, which has been a tremendous thing. But for her to be able to go through that healing process so that we as a family can be restored is an amazing miracle.
It's I think people oftentimes forget about the other side, right? And so they forget, the victims in this, in this case, your wife, who's the subject of betrayal, receiving a betrayal rather, so it's really good to know that she had to do her own work to overcome this, because it is a huge. I mean, it can go on forever about all the things, that the betrayal and the hurt and the disappointment, all these sorts of things.
Yeah.
So I'm really happy to hear that. I'm curious what gave you, or what, I don't know, something made you write that letter to confess? Like, how did that all come about? Was that just because again, there's no doubt that you knew that you were wrong what you're doing, and I think you understood that. But it still happened, right? So now you're confessing and looking for forgiveness and wanting to own or take accountability for your actions. Was there like a driving force? Was it like just a case of kind of hitting rock bottom where sometimes people need to be, or what was going on for you at that time?
I think there were two things. Not saying there weren't more than two, but there were two things that kind of stand out. They were probably were driving forces there. Mm-hmm. One of them was, like I said, I truly did feel. I remember talking to my coworkers about it. One in particular, and then my boss, who we're a crew, and so we're pretty tight knit, and so like they both knew about what I was doing, and they were both like, "Dude, that's a terrible idea. Don't do that." So, but I truly did think, like, I'm not gonna do it again. So yeah, like why would I not come clean, right? Because I'm never gonna do it again. And I think I felt like this is gonna cement my conviction. Like, it's one thing to say I'm never gonna do it, but now I'm gonna write a letter. I'm gonna tell my wife. So whether there was logic there or not, I think that was a big part of it. Was this is gonna really cement that choice. And then the other part, there was a lot of selfishness. It felt good to be able to get it off my chest. It felt good to come clean. Hiding a secret, doesn't feel good. Hiding a deep, dark secret, of course, from a spiritual level, from a physical level, like psychological, all of that, right? It does not feel good to hide a double life. And so it felt good. Now, of course, that can be a good motivation if I actually change my behavior, right? But in my case, I didn't change my behavior. I just I just threw up all this crap on her, and then eventually, went back to the same old ways.
Right.
And every time I would confess to her, and this is, something that I've learned now in recovery,
Mhm.
is, every time I was confessing to her, I was just wounding her again.
Gotcha.
Because again, there was not repentance, there was
Right.
not changed behavior. It was just
Right.
boom, knife wound, again and again.
Right. Right.
And that, of course, none of that's to say that if somebody, if somebody was unfaithful, that they shouldn't be honest about it. But there needs to be an infrastructure for that.
Yeah.
And so, like in my case in recovery, even so, like once I got into the mentorship program, I didn't cheat on her again. I didn't go back to my addiction. But there were still times where I'd cross a boundary. There's still times where I made a bad choice. Of course, what those choices looked like, they got progressively healthier, or the collateral damage of those choices got lower and lower as time went on, the frequency between those choices, but it wasn't just, okay, every time I'm going to share this stuff with her. It was, I would share it with my accountability partners, share it with my mentor, and he would work through it and process through it. So it's not just this open, just bleh, I'm just going to throw all this up on my wife all the time.
Right. Yeah. Again, I'm just sort of putting myself, if I was in her shoes, and sort of what all this happening at once, and then your point about the re-injuring
Yeah.
thing and in your mind, you think you're doing this good thing,
Right.
but you're just making it worse and worse and worse and worse for each time. I know everything is a process, and everything everything is part of a process. Do you talk about where your relationship now, where it's now, and in this process?
Yeah. It's an amazing thing. My wife and I have always been best buddies, which might sound crazy,
Okay.
but we've always been best friends. We've always enjoyed time together, even through the darkest of times. And maybe that's one of the few reasons why she even stayed with me, having kids with me, and then being best friends. Because of course she had every right to leave me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that part was like, okay, and we're best friends now. But the openness to our relationship is so different. The vulnerability, we can just talk about whatever. We can just enjoy life, and there's no secrets. There's no hidden anything.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a beautiful thing. And for us to have gone, even though we went through this trauma, we went through this journey, coming from very different perspectives. Me as the antagonist, me as the assailant, and her as that victim initially. But because we've both gone through this healing, there's an incredible bond that we know the darkness of our past. I'm so blessed, to be able to continue living life with her, of course, right?
Mm.
And so now, like, we serve in recovery together. She leads a women's group for sexual betrayal trauma. And then I lead a men's group for men struggling with sexual addiction. And of course, we're doing different things. We're working with different groups of people.
Yep.
And we don't, with anonymity, obviously, we're not sharing specifics of what we're doing in our groups. But still, like, we're able to, we debrief, and just kind of talk about like what we're working through, in general, not mentioning people's names and stuff, but just, we just get to talk about recovery. And recovery is a joint passion of ours, which just makes it just makes everything else, it makes everything else just so much stronger and so much more beautiful, because of the foundation of what our relationship is based on. Recognizing God's grace in our story, recognizing, all of the blessings that we've been given. Because logically, not only should we not be together,
Yep.
who knows where I should be, right? And then, a lot of women in her shoes, understandably, are they're going to be a shell of themselves, because they've been battered and hurt for so many years.
Mm-hmm.
I a couple of years ago, so we've been able to share our testimony jointly on multiple occasions, which is an awesome thing to be able to do. And
oh my gosh, it's so powerful.
And we were doing some editing on our testimony, adding a couple things, and then kind of updating some of the verbiage in there. And we were editing this portion. So we're looking at, printed off the pages, and we're sitting on the couch at night. We were gonna share our testimony the next day. And again, we'd done it to that point. We'd done it a few times together. We were gonna share it again. And so we're going through looking at these pages. And she was looking at a paragraph. Carrie was looking at a paragraph detailing one of the times that I confessed another affair. I don't remember which one this was. It probably was like 2013, 2014. So this was several years in, and still, a while before recovery. And in this story, in this account, I had shared that I had another affair, and Carrie was sharing in the testimony how she's laying on the bathroom floor, just screaming out to God, why me? Why?
Right.
And so it's like this, an absolute horror story of this, one of the darkest moments that you could have in a marriage. And Carrie, she's sharing, or we're reading this together, and she's asking me, she goes, okay, so, this one spot right now, it's a semicolon, should we make it a period, or should that be a separate paragraph? And I don't remember the exact grammar that we were debating, but we were debating grammar.
Right.
And I remember in that moment, God allowed me to kind of zoom out and just look at what this was. We're sitting here on the couch debating the grammar and the sentence structure of a moment that was one of many moments that absolutely should have just destroyed not only our family, but destroyed our legacy, our children's lives forever.
Yeah.
But God used even these darkest moments to be part of our testimony, and to be able to sit there and have those moments, let alone all the moments of joy and raising our boys together and doing life together. Every single day, I thank God for recovery. Every single day, I thank God for what He's given me, because I'm literally surrounded by so many things that I should not have.
Sure. Yeah. That's a powerful image on the couch, and again, having a conversation over grammar when there's so much bigger things that could have taken place that didn't happen. And so there's a lot that you can look at and be appreciative and thankful for. I wonder if, Logan, you could sort of talk about I guess the how you did it, and I know you referenced different recovery tools, but what did the how part look like?
Yeah. My infrastructure got completely transformed. So I'll unpack what that means. The group that I got traction in, the group that I was a part of, that we had a mentorship program. So Prodigals, there are other groups, but every group is different. That's with any recovery organization, Celebrate Recovery, AA, whatever. Every group is different. So I'll speak to the ones that I'm a part of that I know about. So up here in Alaska, there's a weekly group that is Prodigals. And then as an elective program that's separate from just the weekly meeting, there's a Prodigals mentorship program. And when it was shared with me that this was available, it was like, hey, this is super, super hard. This is not a lightweight program at all. It's going to take a long time. But at that point, I'd gotten an ultimatum from Carrie, you need to make changes. You got to do some stuff. You got to make some serious changes. And so once that was made available to me, thankfully, I did jump in and did embrace it. Because again, I was I had no hope for so long that when I met those guys and I saw that program, I'm like, okay, I don't know what's going to work. I don't know what these guys had to do to get where they're at, but I'll try it. I'm willing to try it. So this program was basically 2 years of voluntary house arrest. Not from a legal standpoint. I was living at my home, but I couldn't basically do anything outside of my regimen, my schedule, without permission, without a written safety plan. For a while at the start of my program, when I would go to work, when I would go to lunch, I had to take a selfie and send it to my mentor. Didn't have to do that forever, but that was a requirement that he had at first. Every guy's addiction manifests differently, right? So every guy's boundaries and rules and structures can be a little bit different depending on what the mentor requires of him. I had to make a phone call every single day, not just a phone call, to talk about how I'm doing, but a recovery call, a phone call to a brother in the program. So it's it's not my pastor, it's not my mom, it's not Carrie, it's not my buddy. I mean, all of those things might be great, but this needs to be a phone call to a brother in the trenches that understands where I'm coming from and who knows
accountability, right? Wow.
Right. And it's because I mean, I had spent years grooming myself to be a really good liar, to be a manipulator, to be somebody that could work the room, right? So I needed people who knew what it was to be a liar, who knew what it was to be a manipulator, who knew what it was to put BS out there, and guys who would love me enough to call me out on my garbage, call me out and be like, hey, you're being super vague with this. What's going on here? When you say this word, what do you mean by that? Unpack that for me.
Right.
And not every phone call was like that, but there were definitely phone calls where I got my feelings hurt. There were phone calls where I would get frustrated, right? And it's like, that's okay. It taught me to shut up and listen. It taught me to chew on feedback, chew on some counsel. Maybe I didn't necessarily, I wouldn't always do what that brother was saying, but I would consider it. I would think about, okay, what would it look like if I did take his advice? And more often than not, I would. And there were phone calls where I didn't necessarily get feedback. My brother might say, hey, I don't have anything for you. Thanks for making the phone call. And even in those calls, there's so much power to making a phone call, putting myself out there and making myself vulnerable to feedback. It's not necessarily about the advice I'm going to get. I'm opening myself up to the idea that somebody else might tell me what to do. And that's okay. Somebody else might give me advice. They might ask me a bunch of tough questions, and that's okay. Even if in that moment I didn't necessarily get grilled, the mere fact that I was willing to get grilled, if that's what it took, there's a lot of transformation that happens in those phone calls. So, I mean, it was definitely, heavy duty accountability.
Yeah.
So a lot of behavior modification, but one of the beauties of the Prodigals mentorship program is it's not behavior modification for the sake of behavior modification. It's a Christ-centered program. So it is centered on, it's centered around healing through a relationship with Christ. It's a 12-step recovery program. So it absolutely, it ties into practical fundamentals of recovery, of what it takes to work through that, the inventory, the amends and all that. It's not a quick process. It's about 2 years on average, 2 years for me. And yet it also dives super deep into the science of what's happening to my brain when I am looking at porn, when I'm chasing after those dopamine hits. And how can I rewire my brain? How can I rebuild those structures in a healthy way? So it's this incredible marriage of the spiritual, the practical, the scientific, all three of those blended together. And a lot of community.
Well, I was going to say, the part that really stands out, you talk about the infrastructure, right? And your infrastructure, the need to change your infrastructure and what's around you. Because ultimately that around you, that community, that infrastructure, those are your supports that will ultimately make the difference. And really there is a safety blanket, right?
Yeah.
I don't think anyone ever goes to any sort of recovery period and they go from here to there and instantly. There's a little bit of regression. I think that's the natural part of the process. The cold turkey thing, it doesn't work, at least for no sustained period of time. And so to know they have that support network there, it makes a big difference.
Yeah. And even if I could have snapped my fingers, because I remember I asked God many times, like, just take it away from me, just like make it so that I just don't get tempted. And like, I firmly believe God could have done that, but there wouldn't have been healing through that. Because healing takes time and work, right? There needs to be some pain involved for me to actually heal and grow. If I had snapped my fingers and just didn't struggle anymore, like, sure, I mean, that would have removed some damage, that would have removed some of that, but I wouldn't have all of the growth that came from recovery. I mean, I shared with you earlier all these other problems, right? We always look at the iceberg in recovery, right? At the very top.
Yes.
Okay, that's me looking at porn. That's me texting women. But underneath that is my fears and my insecurities and all, and my anger, right? So all of that stuff, recovery gave me the tools to work through that. When I finally got really serious, really intentional about working through my anger, I mean, I tried, just like I had with sexual addiction, I tried different things. I went to anger management. I went to a recovery group for anger. I did different, and I'm not saying that none of that stuff helped. I think all that stuff was a part of it, but the biggest change, absolutely, was when I finally went, okay, none of this is seeming to be like the cure, but you know what works? I know phone calls work. And this is a couple of years after I even graduated. And so I committed to making daily phone calls again, set up accountability around that. And I made daily phone calls for several months. I think it was almost a year, making daily phone calls about my anger specifically, because it's like, well, I've been given these tools. I've been given this infrastructure. Why not tap into that?
Yes.
Right. And it was a beautiful thing because it was humbling for me to go like, man, I've been sober for quite a while, been graduated for, but I'm gonna go back to my roots. I'm gonna go back to what works. Why not? How much of a fool would I be to ignore that? Right.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah. I gotta tell you, Logan, I love. I mean, obviously, the story starts. It's very challenging, without question. I mean, addiction of any sort is challenging and difficult. I'm not minimizing yours at all, but in terms of just what people go through, the impacts and what it does to families and all the ripple effects. And so, to know that you sort of gone through that journey, you've gone through there's a forgiveness process for certain, for sure, yourself as well as you receiving from others. In this case, your wife, and then what you're doing afterwards and how you're using that to help others, right? We just talked earlier about there's no new problems under the sun,
Yeah.
and you're showing now through your experiences how that can bring others along to that better place. So I think that's to be commended. Congratulations on the work that you did to get yourself to this point, because it is a big deal, and I definitely do want to acknowledge that. And last thing that I want to ask you about before we go is just around if you were to sort of look back at that person then, how vastly different is he than the person you are today?
There's this juxtaposition in my mind that if you look at a Christmas photo of my family,
Okay.
or you look at a photo of like me and my wife on a date night, you could go through a photo album and like, well, again, because of the evidence of the addiction, it's like, I don't know. I mean, you're a little bit older, you got a little bit less hair back there, but you look about the same, right? I could have a smiling face in the photos,
Yep.
happy little family with the white picket fence, all that.
Yeah.
And the difference when I think back to how I was every single night, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, laying in bed, wanting so badly to not have ever been created, wanting so badly for God to just kill me so that I would stop hurting my wife, stop hurting my kids, stop hurting everyone in my path.
Wow.
Living in that space of absolute despair and going, I hated that I was a dad because my kids had me as a dad. Hated that I was a husband because my wife had me as a husband.
Right.
Living in that space for years. And like any good thing that I ever did for anyone, like there was no satisfaction in that. It's like, I'm a monster. I'm a predator. I hated myself, hated my life.
Right.
So now to be able to just live in a genuine space of, I'm not perfect. I'm always going to have work to do, but I can be proud of the man that I am. I'm proud of the husband that I am. I'm proud of the dad that I am. And I can talk openly with my boys. Like my boys, they're 12, 11, almost 10, and 8.
Mm-hmm.
And on a little bit different levels for like the oldest, the youngest, but on some level, they all know our story.
Gotcha.
They all know that where I had taken my life and where, Carrie and she had stepped up and the ultimatum and all of that. They know that. And we can talk about life, whether it's about addiction or just other stuff. And, speaking from that perspective, it's such a huge blessing just to be able to live life as a genuine human and not have to, not have this double life of just shame and self-hatred.
Wow. Beautiful. Absolutely beautiful. Logan, your message is certainly filled with hope and encouragement and so much more for and you think of individuals who are going through their own challenges, and so to hear what you've had to go through and what your journey was, there's no question in my mind that you make a difference for others. So congratulations on that. Thank you for being here. This has been really awesome, being as open and as vulnerable as you have been and sharing. For listeners that wanted to connect with you, or maybe learn more about you, or I know you have recovery groups that you're a part of. What can you tell us?
Yeah, the best way for folks to connect or to kind of follow what I'm doing, learn more about what I'm doing, Instagram is definitely the best way. I pour a lot into that. So every day there's going to be usually 2 to 3 videos. And if there's been any value or benefit to, what we've talked about here today, it's going to be a lot of that. And so, I'm not on there preaching about the evils of the porn industry and societies. I'm trying to talk about, hey, what can I do differently, right? What can you do differently? Yeah. What things can you do if you're working on being a healthier person? Yeah. And of course, it's from the perspective of sexual addiction.
Sure.
And so there's a lot of practical, pragmatic approaches that I put in those videos. And at the same time, if you don't necessarily struggle with sexual addiction, you have a different addiction, or you have a different area of your life, like me with anger, right? Where you're trying to work on stuff. 90% of what I'm talking about is going to be actionable for you, because what we're talking about here is getting healthier, restructuring my decision-making process. Like, that's going to apply. And also, if you're somebody who, you're a spouse, you're a parent, you're a pastor or a leader, and you just want to understand more about this, even if you don't personally have an addiction or a huge struggle, I promise you, addiction recovery, especially sexual addiction and sexual betrayal trauma, there are not enough resources out there. So on Instagram, I'm at No Longer in Bondage, and periods between the words no longer in bondage. Of course, my name is Logan Hufford. If you don't have Instagram, I'll give you a website. It's particlesofalaska.com, and you can put the links in the show notes, but
sure.
There's contact info there. If folks want to reach out, if you have a question, absolutely reach out. And then, if you want to just understand more about how to get help, how to reach out, how to find a good recovery group, because obviously, people are all over the world, been blessed to be able to talk to people from Gambia and Australia and England. So I don't know what's available to you, but I can help walk you through what it looks like to build that infrastructure that we're talking about. So yeah, definitely Instagram is the best way. And then if need be, check out that website.
Awesome. Logan, this has been great, man. Thank you again for doing this. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing, and all the best to you and your family, my friend.
Thank you so much, Audley.
Back we're here on the podcast. In our chat with Logan, we learned that overcoming sexual addiction is a journey that really requires courage, perseverance, and a commitment to self-discovery. By facing our inner demons and seeking support, we can break free from the shackles of addiction and really create a life filled with purpose and fulfillment. For listeners who want to connect with Logan directly or learn more about the services, the work that he does, the contact details, as always, can be found in the show notes below. I'd encourage you to reach out to him today and take that first step towards a much brighter future. We've sadly reached the end of the Audacious Living Podcast. I want to thank all of our listeners for tuning in. If you've enjoyed today's episodes, please consider following, subscribing, and sharing if you haven't already done so, because of that's of course how we reach even more listeners. Together, let's empower each other to live audaciously and embrace the limitless possibilities that life has to offer. Until next time, stay safe, be kind, show love to one another, and be audacious.
You've been listening to the Audacious Living Podcast, hosted by Audley Stephenson. If you enjoyed what you heard, be sure to like, subscribe, and share. Until next time, be audacious.